She was invisible to her husband, until a short pajama made the millionaire desperate for her love. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She had become a ghost in her own home. Helena Carter stood at the kitchen island of their sprawling Malibu mansion, watching the steam rise from Richard's untouched coffee. The marble countertops gleamed under the soft morning light, filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows. But the beauty of their home felt hollow now. Everything was perfect. The imported Italian furniture, the fresh orchids she replaced weekly, the view of the Pacific stretching endlessly beyond their manicured lawn, everything except her marriage. At 29, Helena possessed a natural elegance that had once stopped Richard Cole in his tracks. Her deep brown skin glowed with warmth, and her natural curls framed her face in soft waves that she'd learned to love after years of straightening them to fit into corporate spaces. Today, she wore a cream silk blouse and tailored navy pants, professional, polished, invisible. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7:30. Right on schedule, Richard's footsteps echoed down the marble staircase. Helena's heart still fluttered at the sound, even after 4 years of marriage. Some habits die hard. Richard Cole entered the kitchen like he entered every room, commanding attention without trying. At 38, he was the kind of man who wore power effortlessly. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored to his athletic frame, his dark hair styled with just enough casualness to seem approachable, though his steel-grey eyes remained focused on his phone screen. "Good morning," Helena said softly, sliding the coffee toward him along with the financial reports he'd requested. He didn't look up, already absorbed in whatever crisis demanded his attention today. His fingers moved rapidly across the screen, and Helena found herself memorizing the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the same expression he'd worn when he used to focus entirely on her. She had married Richard Cole, the man who brought her flowers on random Tuesdays and knew exactly how she liked her tea. Somewhere along the way, that man had been consumed by Richard Cole, the CEO of Technova Industries, worth $2.3 billion and climbing. "I was thinking," Helena began, then paused when Richard's phone rang. He answered without hesitation. "Cole here." His voice shifted into business mode, sharp, decisive, completely present for whoever was on the other end. "No, we can't accept those terms. Set up a meeting for this afternoon." Helena waited, holding her breath, hoping he'd remember she'd been speaking. But Richard grabbed his coffee and the reports, still talking as he headed toward the door. "Helena packed your lunch," she called after him, gesturing to the insulated bag on the counter. "Your favorite, turkey and Swiss on sourdough." He paused at the doorway, phone still pressed to his ear, and looked back. For a moment, Helena saw something flicker in his expression. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. He mouthed, "Thank you," before disappearing into the garage. The house fell silent except for the distant sound of his Tesla pulling out of the driveway. Helena sank onto one of the kitchen stools, staring at the abandoned lunch bag. She'd gotten up an hour early to make it, the way she used to during their first year of marriage, when he'd call her from the office just to say he loved the little notes she tucked inside. When was the last time he'd actually taken lunch with him? Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister, Maya. "Coffee later, I have news." Helena smiled despite herself. Maya was the opposite of everything Helena had become. Loud, spontaneous, unapologetically herself. At 26, she ran a successful boutique in downtown Los Angeles and had never let any man make her feel small. "Can't today. Richard might be home early," Helena typed back, though they both knew that was unlikely. "Girl, you're making yourself invisible. When's the last time you did something just for you?" Helena stared at the message, her sister's words hitting harder than intended. When was the last time? She couldn't remember. The day stretched ahead of her like every other day. She'd manage the household staff, approve the weekly menu, respond to charity invitations on Richard's behalf, and wait. Always waiting for him to come home, to see her, to remember that she existed beyond her function as the perfect CEO's wife. But tonight, something had to change. As evening approached, Helena stood before her walk-in closet, running her hands over the rows of designer dresses and tailored suits. Everything elegant, everything appropriate, everything designed to blend seamlessly into Richard's world. But tucked away in the back, behind clothes she rarely wore anymore, was a simple silk pajama set, soft pink, with delicate lace trim. She'd bought it during their honeymoon in Paris when Richard couldn't keep his hands off her, when every glance felt like a promise. Helena pulled the set from its hanger, holding it against her chest. The silk was cool against her skin, and for a moment she remembered what it felt like to be desired, not just needed. She heard the garage door open downstairs. Richard was home. Tonight, she wouldn't greet him with reports and schedules. Tonight, she wouldn't disappear into the background of her own life. Tonight, she would remind him and herself that Helena Carter still existed. Helena slipped into the pajamas, her reflection in the mirror surprising her. The woman looking back wasn't the invisible wife who'd made coffee that morning. She was someone bolder, someone who deserved to be seen. Taking a deep breath, she walked downstairs, her bare feet silent on the cool marble. Richard was in his study, jacket discarded, tie loosened, completely absorbed in his computer screen. Helena stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him, gathering her courage. "Richard," she said quietly. He looked up, and in that instant, everything changed. His eyes widened, traveling from her face down her silk-clad figure and back again. The pen in his hand clattered to the desk. For the first time in months, Richard Cole was completely, utterly focused on his wife, and Helena realized she had no idea what happened next. Time seemed to freeze in the space between them. Richard's grey eyes swept over Helena with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. The CEO who could negotiate billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat appeared completely undone by the sight of his wife in silk pajamas. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came. Helena felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Under his gaze, she became acutely aware of everything. The way the silk moved against her skin, how the soft fabric outlined her curves, the fact that she was standing in their home, feeling like a stranger in her own body. "Helena." Richard's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. He stood slowly from his chair, never breaking eye contact. "What are you?" "I'm standing in my own house," she interrupted, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "In front of my own husband. Is that so unusual?" Something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe guilt. He took a step toward her, then stopped, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. For once, Richard Cole looked uncertain. "You look—" He swallowed hard. "Beautiful. You always look beautiful, but tonight you're— What different?" Helena lifted her chin, drawing strength from somewhere deep inside. "Or are you finally seeing me?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Richard's jaw tightened, and Helena watched him struggle with words that had been left unspoken for too long. "I see you every day," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Helena laughed softly, a sound that held no humor. "Do you? When was the last time we had a real conversation, Richard? When did you last ask me how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what I want? Helena, that's not fair." She stepped into the study, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. "You want to know what's not fair? Making someone feel invisible in their own marriage." Richard's face went pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but Helena held up her hand. "I've been patient, Richard. I've understood that your work is demanding. I've made excuses for every missed dinner, every distracted conversation, every night you came to bed after I was already asleep." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "But I'm tired of being patient with a man who's forgotten I exist." "That's not true," Richard said, but his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "Isn't it?" Helena moved closer, close enough to see the conflict warring in his eyes. "When was the last time you touched me? Really touched me, not just a distracted kiss goodbye or rolling over in bed?" Richard's breathing became shallow. The question hit its mark, and they both knew it. "I've been busy." "Too busy for your wife?" Helena's voice cracked slightly, revealing the pain beneath her newfound boldness. "Too busy for the woman who's been waiting for you to come home every night for 4 years? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9:30, its sound echoing through the tension-filled room. Helena watched Richard struggle with emotions he'd apparently buried under spreadsheets and corporate strategy. "Helena, He reached toward her, then let his hand fall. "I didn't realize." "Of course you didn't." She shook her head, curls catching the warm light from his desk lamp. "You've been so focused on building your empire that you forgot about the woman standing beside you." Richard's jaw clenched. "Everything I do is for us, for our future." "What future, Richard?" Helena's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. "A future where I'm just another beautiful object in your perfectly arranged life, where I smile at charity galas and host dinner parties and pretend I'm not dying inside?" The words hit Richard like physical blows. He staggered slightly, gripping the edge of his desk. "You're not just—" "Yes, I am." Helena's voice was steady now, resolved. "I've become exactly what I swore I'd never be, a trophy wife who's forgotten she used to have dreams of her own." Richard stared at her, really seeing her for what felt like the first time in months. The woman standing before him wasn't just beautiful, she was fierce, intelligent, hurt, and fighting for something he'd been too blind to protect. "What dreams?" he asked quietly. The question surprised Helena. She'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even dismissal, not genuine curiosity. "I wanted to finish my master's degree in psychology," she said softly. "I dreamed of opening my own practice, helping couples rebuild their relationships, maybe writing a book about love and connection. I had plans, Richard, real dreams. But somewhere along the way I became so focused on being the perfect wife that I forgot who I was before I met you." Richard's face crumpled slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" "When?" Helena laughed bitterly. "Between your conference calls and board meetings, during the 30 seconds you're actually present at dinner." "Helena, no." She shook her head, taking a step back. "I'm not done. You want to know why I'm standing here in silk pajamas looking like someone you suddenly can't resist?" Richard nodded, his grey eyes intense. "Because I need to know if my husband still exists under all that corporate armor. I need to know if the man who used to bring me coffee in bed and listen to my terrible jokes is still in there somewhere." Helena's voice broke on the last words, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. Richard moved then, crossing the distance between them in 2 quick strides. He reached for her face, but Helena stepped back. "I don't want your pity, Richard," she whispered, "and I don't want to be desired just because I finally got your attention." "Then what do you want?" His voice was raw, desperate. Helena looked at him for a long moment. This man she'd loved since she was 25, this stranger she'd married. "I want to be loved every day," she said simply. "Not just when I'm standing half naked in your study." Richard's hand fell to his side, and Helena saw something break open in his expression. And in that moment, she realized she'd just issued the ultimatum that would either save their marriage or end it. The silence that followed Helena's ultimatum was deafening. Richard stood frozen, his grey eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. The confident CEO who commanded boardrooms and closed million-dollar deals looked completely lost in his own study, faced with the one negotiation that truly mattered. "Helena," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly, "I had no idea you felt this way." "Of course you didn't." Helena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed in more ways than the silk pajamas revealed. "You've been so busy conquering the world that you forgot to look at what was happening in your own home." Richard ran both hands through his hair, destroying its perfect styling. For once he looked human, vulnerable, scared. I thought you were happy," he said, his voice barely audible. "You never complained. You smiled at the galas, hosted my business dinners perfectly, never asked for anything. Because I was trying to be the wife you needed." Helena's voice rose, years of suppressed frustration finally erupting. "I watched you build Technova from the ground up. I saw how hard you worked, how much pressure you were under, so I made myself smaller, quieter, more convenient." She began pacing the length of his study, her bare feet moving soundlessly across the expensive rug. Richard watched her every movement, transfixed. "Do you know what I did today, Richard? I spent 2 hours arranging flowers for a house you barely notice. I coordinated with the chef about meals you eat while reading emails. I RSVP'd to events where you'll network while I smile and nod and pretend I don't have thoughts of my own. You could have told me." "When?" Helena spun to face him, her curls catching the lamplight. "During your morning calls, your lunch meetings, your evening conference calls with Tokyo, or maybe during those 5 minutes before you fall asleep scrolling through your phone." Each word hit Richard like a physical blow. He sank into his leather chair, his face pale. "I never meant for this to happen," he said quietly. "But it did happen." Helena's voice softened, showing the pain beneath her anger. "We happened, Richard. We became strangers who share a bed and a last name and nothing else." She moved to the window, looking out at the lights of Malibu stretching toward the ocean. In the reflection she could see Richard watching her, his expression devastated. "I used to dream about us," she continued, her voice distant. "Not just the psychology practice or the book. I dreamed about our life together. Children maybe, lazy Sunday mornings, growing old and still being excited to talk to each other." She laughed bitterly. "Instead, I got a mansion and a credit card with no limit, and a husband who treats me like expensive furniture." "That's not—" Yes, it is. Helena turned back to him, tears glistening in her dark eyes. Beautiful. Well-maintained, perfectly placed and completely ignored unless there's company coming. Richard stood abruptly, knocking over his coffee mug. The dark liquid spread across his important papers, but for once he didn't care about the mess. Don't say that, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You're not furniture. You're my wife. You're... What? Helena challenged. What am I to you, Richard? Besides convenient. You're everything, he said desperately. You're my anchor, my calm in the storm. When everything at work is chaos, I know I can come home to you. Helena stared at him, her heart breaking all over again. That's exactly the problem, she whispered. I'm not your partner, Richard. I'm your refuge. A safe place you retreat to when the world gets too hard. But I'm not a place, I'm a person. A person with dreams and needs and feelings you've completely forgotten about. I haven't forgotten. Then tell me. Helena stepped closer, challenging him with her proximity. Tell me one thing I wanted that wasn't related to this house or your career. One dream I shared with you. One fear I confided. One hope I whispered in the dark. Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. His grey eyes searched desperately, but Helena could see the awful truth dawning on his face. He couldn't remember. Not one thing. Oh, God, he breathed, sinking back into his chair. Helena, You see, her voice was gentle now, almost pitying. You've been so focused on providing for me that you forgot to actually know me. But I love you, Richard said, the words sounding hollow even to him. Do you? Helena asked quietly. Or do you love the idea of me, the perfectly polished wife who makes your life easier? Richard's face crumpled. I don't know how to fix this. Neither do I, Helena admitted, her own voice breaking. Because I don't know if there's anything left to fix. The grandfather clock chimed 10 o'clock, marking another hour of their unraveling marriage. Helena wiped away a tear and started toward the door. Where are you going? Richard asked, panic creeping into his voice. To bed, Helena said without turning around. To our bed, where I'll lie awake wondering if the man I married is still in there somewhere, or if he's been completely consumed by the empire he built. Helena, wait. She paused in the doorway, her silk pajamas shimmering in the hallway light. I meant what I said, Richard. I don't want to be desired just tonight because silk pajamas finally got your attention. I want to be loved every day, seen every day, valued for who I am, not what I do for you. And if I can't? The question escaped him before he could stop it. Helena turned slowly, her dark eyes meeting his grey ones across the room. Then I guess we'll both know where we stand. With that, she disappeared into the hallway, leaving Richard alone with the magnitude of what he was about to lose. And for the first time in years, he realized that all his success meant nothing if he lost the only woman who'd ever truly mattered. Richard didn't move from his study for 2 hours. He sat in his leather chair, staring at the spilled coffee staining his quarterly reports, but seeing only Helena's face when she'd asked him to remember one personal thing about her. The look of devastating disappointment when he couldn't answer, the way her voice had broken when she called herself expensive furniture. How had he become the kind of man who could forget his own wife's dreams? At 1:17 a.m., he finally climbed the marble staircase to their bedroom. The house felt different in the darkness, less like a showcase and more like the empty shell Helena had described. Each step echoed his growing realization that somewhere along the way he'd lost everything that mattered while chasing everything that didn't. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. Richard pushed it open carefully, expecting to find Helena asleep, but she was sitting by the window seat, knees drawn up, still in those silk pajamas that had started this entire unraveling. She didn't turn when he entered. I've been thinking, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the moonlit room. Richard's heart clenched. Those words in that tone never led anywhere good. About us, he asked, though he dreaded the answer. About the woman I used to be. Helena finally looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the city lights beyond their window. Do you remember when we first met? Richard moved closer, drawn by something fragile in her voice. At the Stanford alumni mixer, you were arguing with some venture capitalist about the ethics of data mining. Helena's lips curved into the faintest smile. You remember that? You were magnificent, Richard said, the memory suddenly vivid, passionate, brilliant, completely unintimidated by a room full of tech executives. I couldn't take my eyes off you. I was working on my thesis then, Helena continued, still staring out the window, about how couples lose emotional intimacy in high-stress environments. Ironic, isn't it? Richard felt like he'd been punched. Helena, I interviewed dozens of couples where one partner's career success had destroyed their connection. She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. I thought I was so smart, so aware of the pitfalls. I was going to be different. You are different. No, Richard, I'm not. Helena stood and moved to their king-size bed sitting on the edge. I became exactly what I studied, the neglected partner who adapts and accommodates until she disappears. Richard wanted to deny it, to fight her words, but they felt too true. He sat in the chair across from the bed, afraid to get closer. When did it start? He asked quietly. Helena considered this. Remember your first big acquisition, TechFlow Industries? Richard nodded. It had been a crucial deal, the one that really launched Technova into the major leagues. You worked 18-hour days for 3 months, Helena continued. I understood. I made excuses for cancelled dinners, postponed weekend trips, conversations cut short by urgent calls. I told myself it was temporary. It was temporary, Richard protested weakly. Was it? Helena's gaze met his. Because then came the Phoenix expansion. Then the European contracts. Then the government partnerships. There was always another deal, another crisis, another reason why everything else had to wait. Richard opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. She was right. I stopped talking about my thesis, Helena continued, her voice getting softer. You'd nod and say, that's nice, honey, while reading emails. So I stopped mentioning my classes, then my professors, then my dreams of opening a practice. Why didn't you fight for it? Richard asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Helena looked at him with something that might have been pity. I did fight, Richard, but you can't fight for someone's attention. Either they give it freely, or they don't. But I gave you everything else. Everything except yourself. Helena's voice broke slightly. Do you know what it's like to live with someone who's physically present, but emotionally absent? To feel like you're competing with a company for your husband's love? Richard felt tears prick his eyes. I thought I was building something for us. You were building something for you, Helena corrected gently, and expecting me to be grateful for the scraps of attention you had left over. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 4 years of unspoken resentment settling between them. I used to practice conversations with you, Helena admitted suddenly. What do you mean? In the shower, while cooking, driving to charity events. I'd rehearse things I wanted to tell you, hoping to find the right words to break through your distraction. She smiled sadly. I had this whole speech prepared about wanting to go back to school. I practiced it for weeks. What happened to it? I finally tried to give it. Last Christmas Eve, remember? You got that call from the Tokyo office during dinner. Richard's stomach dropped. He remembered the call, remembered thinking it was important. He couldn't remember what Helena had been trying to say. You took the call, Helena continued, and when you came back the moment was gone, so I just asked if you wanted dessert instead. Jesus, Helena. Richard buried his face in his hands. I'm a monster. No, she said quietly. You're just a man who forgot that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. Richard looked up at her. This beautiful, brilliant woman he'd somehow managed to lose without even realizing it. Is it too late? He whispered. Helena was quiet for so long that Richard thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words were barely audible. I don't know, but I know that wanting to change isn't the same as actually changing. Then tell me how, Richard said desperately. Tell me what to do. Helena studied his face in the moonlight, searching for something she desperately wanted to find. Start by proving that you remember why you fell in love with me in the first place, she said finally. Not the woman who makes your life easier, the woman who challenged you, inspired you, made you want to be better. And if I can't remember? Helena's smile was heartbreaking. Then we'll both know that the Richard Cole I married really is gone. She stood and walked toward the bathroom, pausing at the doorway. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight, she said without turning around. I need space to think. Richard watched her go, her silk pajamas disappearing into the darkness, and realized that the most important deal of his life was slipping through his fingers. And for once, he had no idea how to close it. Richard didn't sleep at all. He lay in their king-size bed, staring at Helena's empty side, trying to remember the woman who had captivated him 7 years ago. The silk pillowcase still held the faint scent of her vanilla perfume, and he found himself burying his face in it, like a drowning man reaching for air. Remember why you fell in love with her. Helena's challenge echoed through his mind as dawn crept through their bedroom windows. Richard sat up, running his hands through his disheveled hair, and for the first time in years he ignored the buzzing of his phone announcing the day's first crisis. Instead, He walked to his closet and pulled down a dusty box from the top shelf, something he hadn't touched since they'd moved to Malibu. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing photo albums, ticket stubs, and handwritten notes from their early relationship. The first photo stopped him cold. Helena at 25, laughing at something off camera during their weekend trip to Napa Valley. Her natural curls caught the golden afternoon light, and her smile was so radiant it seemed to illuminate the entire picture. But it wasn't her beauty that had captured him. It was the intelligence sparkling in her dark eyes, the way she gestured passionately while making a point about sustainable farming practices to their wine tour guide. "You were fearless," Richard whispered to the photograph. He flipped through more pictures, each one bringing back memories he'd somehow buried under years of quarterly reports and board meetings. Helena debating social justice with his Harvard friends at a dinner party, completely unintimidated by their attempts to dismiss her views. Helena dragging him to a community theatre production because she believed in supporting local arts. Helena staying up all night to help him prepare for his first major investor pitch, challenging every weak point in his presentation until it was bulletproof. Richard found a folded piece of paper tucked between photos, a note Helena had written during his second year building Technova. "Richard, I know you'll probably read this at 2 a.m. between emails, but I wanted you to know how proud I am of what you're building. Not because of the money or the recognition, but because you're solving problems that matter. You're going to change the world, and I can't wait to watch you do it. Just don't forget to change yourself too. Stay the man who brings me terrible coffee in bed and listens to my psychology theories like they're the most important things in the world. I love you. H." Richard's throat tightened. When was the last time he'd brought her coffee in bed? When was the last time he'd asked about her theories, her thoughts, her dreams? A soft knock on the door interrupted his spiral of regret. Helena entered carefully, dressed in jeans and a cream sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked beautiful and distant, like a stranger wearing his wife's face. "I'm going to Maya's for the day," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "I need to think." "Helena, wait." Richard stood quickly, still holding the note. "I found this." She glanced at the paper, recognition flickering across her features. "You kept that?" "I kept everything," Richard said, gesturing to the open box. "Pictures, notes, ticket stubs from our first date. I just forgot to look at them." Helena stepped closer, her gaze falling on the scattered memories. She picked up a photo of them at his company's first office, a cramped space above a coffee shop in Palo Alto. In the picture, Helena was helping him hang a whiteboard, both of them laughing at something. "I remember this day," she said softly. "You were so nervous about your first employee starting the next week. I told you that building a team was like building a relationship. It required trust, communication, and seeing people for who they really are." "You were right," Richard said, "about everything. I just stopped listening." Helena set the photo down gently. "I used to love watching you work in those early days. You'd get this look of intense concentration, but you were still present, still you." "What changed?" Richard asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Success changed you. Or maybe it revealed who you really were underneath." Helena's voice was matter-of-fact, which somehow hurt worse than anger. "The bigger Technova got, the smaller everything else became, including me." "That's not true." "Richard, do you remember our 3rd anniversary?" Helena interrupted. Richard searched his memory desperately. "We went to dinner. We had reservations at Le Bernardin. I wore the blue dress you bought me for my birthday. You took 3 phone calls during the appetizer, 2 during the main course and 1 during dessert." Helena's voice remained steady, but Richard could see the pain in her eyes. "I sat there for 2 hours, listening to you negotiate a contract while my anniversary dinner got cold." The memory crashed over him with devastating clarity. He'd thought he was being efficient, handling business so they could enjoy their weekend uninterrupted. He'd been completely oblivious to what the evening meant to her. "I apologized," he began weakly. "You did, and I forgave you, because I thought it was an exception." Helena picked up another photo, their wedding day. "But it wasn't, was it? It was the beginning of a pattern." Richard stared at their wedding photo, remembering how Helena had looked walking down the aisle. Not just beautiful, but radiant with hope and love and excitement for their future together. "I was going to tell you something that night," Helena continued, her voice barely audible. "At dinner." "What?" "I'd been accepted into a doctoral program at UCLA, full scholarship. I wanted to specialize in couples therapy, help other people avoid the mistakes I'd seen in my research." She laughed bitterly. "I was so excited to share it with you." Richard felt like he might be sick. What happened? You took that call from Singapore during dessert. By the time you hung up, the moment was gone, and I realized that my biggest news couldn't compete with your business. Helena wiped away a tear. I turned down the program the next week. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you'd feel guilty and try to fix it after the fact. But I didn't want your guilt, Richard. I wanted your partnership. They stood in silence, surrounded by the remnants of a love story that had slowly been suffocated by ambition and neglect. I remember now, Richard said suddenly, why I fell in love with you. Helena looked up, hope flickering in her dark eyes. It wasn't just because you were beautiful or smart or kind, though you were all of those things. Richard stepped closer, his voice growing stronger. I fell in love with you because you saw me, not my potential or my ambitions or what I could become. You saw me, flaws and all, and somehow decided I was worth loving. And then you stopped seeing me, Helena whispered. Yes, the admission came out broken. I became so focused on becoming worthy of you that I forgot you'd already chosen me as I was. Helena studied his face, searching for something she wasn't sure she'd find. Remembering isn't enough, Richard, she said finally. I need to know that you can see me again, really see me. Not the woman in these old photos, but who I am now, who I've become despite being invisible for so long. Richard reached for her hand, relief flooding through him when she didn't pull away. Then show me, he said urgently. Help me see you again. Helena's fingers intertwined with his, and for a moment, Richard thought they might find their way back to each other. Then her phone buzzed with a text, and she pulled away to read it. Maya's here, she said, slipping the phone back into her pocket. I have to go. Helena, I meant what I said, Richard. Remembering the past isn't enough. I need to see effort, real change, not just words. She headed toward the door, then paused. The woman you fell in love with is still here, she said without turning around. But she's tired of being invisible. If you want her back, you're going to have to prove she's worth fighting for. And with that, she was gone, leaving Richard alone with the scattered pieces of their love story and the terrifying realization that remembering Helena was only the first step. Now he had to figure out how to win her back. Richard had never cancelled a board meeting before, but at 8:47 a.m., sitting in his home office surrounded by photos of the woman he was losing, he picked up his phone and did exactly that. Cancel everything today, he told his assistant Jennifer, and I mean everything. Reschedule the investor call, postpone the quarterly review, move the lunch with Goldman Sachs. Sir? Jennifer's voice carried obvious confusion. The Goldman Sachs meeting has been scheduled for 3 months. They're flying in from New York specifically. Then they can fly back and reschedule. Richard's voice was firm but not harsh. I have something more important to handle. Are you ill, Mr. Cole? Richard looked at the wedding photo still lying on his desk. I might be dying, actually, but not in the way you think. After hanging up, Richard sat in the unusual silence of his empty calendar. When was the last time he'd had an entire day with no obligations? He couldn't remember. The thought should have terrified him. Millions of dollars depended on his constant attention, but instead he felt something like relief. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from concerned executives, but Richard ignored them all. Today was about Helena. Today was about remembering how to be a husband instead of just a CEO. He started with her coffee. Richard made his way to the kitchen, trying to recall exactly how Helena liked her morning coffee. Dark roast, he remembered, but what else? Cream, sugar. The fact that he didn't know seemed criminal after 4 years of marriage. He found her favorite mug, a simple ceramic piece she'd bought at a farmer's market during their 2nd year together. It was plain compared to the expensive bone china set his decorator had chosen, but Helena always reached for this one. Why had he never asked her about it? Richard made the coffee strong and dark, adding a splash of the oat milk he'd seen her use. He stood there holding the warm mug, suddenly unsure what to do next. Helena was at Maya's house, probably telling her sister about their catastrophic conversation the night before. Instead of dwelling on that thought, Richard grabbed his keys. Maya lived in a converted loft in downtown LA's Arts District, the kind of eclectic space that Helena had once dreamed about before they'd moved to sterile perfection in Malibu. Richard had only visited twice, both times briefly, always checking his phone, always eager to leave. He knocked on the industrial metal door, holding Helena's coffee like a peace offering. Maya opened the door, her expression immediately shifting from surprise to protective suspicion. At 26, Helena's younger sister was everything Richard wasn't: artistic, spontaneous, unimpressed by wealth. She wore paint-splattered overalls and had her natural hair twisted into colorful head wraps. "Well, well," Maya said, crossing her arms. "If it isn't the invisible husband, is Helena here?" Richard asked quietly. "She's here. Question is, why are you?" "I brought her coffee." Richard held up the mug, feeling ridiculous. Maya's expression softened slightly. "You remembered her favorite mug. Is it right? The coffee?" Maya studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. But if you make my sister cry again, I'm throwing you off my fire escape." Richard entered the loft, immediately struck by how alive it felt. Canvases covered the walls, plants hung from the ceiling, and mismatched furniture created cozy conversation areas. It was everything their Malibu mansion wasn't: warm, personal, real. Helena sat curled on a vintage velvet sofa, wearing one of Maya's oversized sweaters. She looked up when Richard entered, surprise flickering across her face. "You came," she said simply. "I brought coffee." Richard held out the mug, suddenly feeling like a teenager asking someone to prom. Helena accepted it, taking a careful sip. Her eyes closed for a moment, and Richard held his breath. "It's perfect," she said softly, and Richard felt a ridiculous surge of pride. "I cancelled my meetings today," he announced. Both sisters stared at him. Maya actually dropped her paintbrush. "All of them?" Helena asked. "Everything. Board meeting, investor calls, the Goldman Sachs lunch." Richard sat on the edge of a mismatched chair, looking directly at Helena. "I wanted to talk to you. Really talk. Without distractions." Maya muttered something about hell freezing over and disappeared into what Richard assumed was her bedroom, giving them privacy. "Richard," Helena began, "cancelling one day doesn't—" "I know." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I know one day doesn't erase 4 years of neglect, but I had to start somewhere." Helena set down her coffee mug, studying his face. "What do you want to talk about?" "You, your dreams, the doctoral program you turned down, why you love that coffee mug, what you think about when you're arranging those flowers I never notice." Richard's words came out in a rush. "I want to know everything I should have been paying attention to." "It's not that simple." "The mug," Richard interrupted gently. "Tell me about the mug." Helena looked down at the ceramic piece in her hands, a small smile playing at her lips. "We bought it at that farmer's market in Santa Barbara, our 2nd anniversary weekend. I remember the weekend. You wanted to leave early for a conference call, but I begged you to walk through the market with me first." Helena's voice grew softer. There was this elderly woman selling pottery. Her hands were shaking from arthritis, but her work was beautiful, simple, honest. Richard listened intently, hanging on every word. "She told me she'd been making pottery for 60 years, that each piece held a memory. When I picked up this mug, she said it reminded her of the first cup of coffee she'd shared with her late husband." Helena's eyes glistened. "She said it was made for love stories. And you've used it every morning since." "Every morning I wanted to remember what love felt like," Helena corrected quietly. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Helena had been holding on to their love story with a coffee mug, while he'd been too distracted to notice. "What else?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "What else what? What else have I missed? What else should I know about my own wife?" Helena was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh whether he was truly ready to hear her answer. "I started taking pottery classes 3 months ago," she said finally. "You did? Tuesday and Thursday evenings, while you're on your calls with Tokyo?" Helena managed a small smile. "I'm terrible at it, but I love the feeling of creating something with my hands, something that's just mine." Richard felt another wave of shame. He'd never even noticed she was gone those evenings. "I also volunteer at the Children's Hospital on Saturdays," she continued, "reading to kids in the cancer ward. And I've been audit classes at UCLA, psychology courses, not enrolled, just keeping the dream alive, I suppose." "Helena," Richard breathed. "I had no idea." "I know. I stopped telling you about my life because you stopped asking." They sat in silence, the weight of lost time settling between them. Richard could hear Maya moving around in her bedroom, probably giving them space while staying close enough to intervene if needed. "I want to ask now," Richard said finally, "about everything. I want to know who you've become while I wasn't paying attention." Helena studied his face, searching for sincerity. "And your business, your empire that requires constant attention?" "We'll still be there tomorrow," Richard said, surprising himself with how true that felt. "But you might not be." Something shifted in Helena's expression, not forgiveness, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of hope. "This can't be a one-day thing, Richard," she said quietly. "I can't go back to being invisible just because you spent one morning remembering I exist." "I know." Richard reached for her hand, relief flooding through him when she didn't pull away. "I'm not asking you to come home today. I'm asking you to let me prove that I can change, really change." Helena's fingers intertwined with his, and for a moment, Richard felt like they might actually find their way back to each other. "One day at a time," she said finally. "One day at a time," Richard agreed. As he sat in Maya's bohemian loft, holding his wife's hand and listening to her talk about pottery classes and hospital volunteering, Richard realized something profound. For the first time in years, he was exactly where he needed to be, and tomorrow, he'd prove it again. "You want to do what?" Helena stared at Richard across the breakfast table of Maya's loft, her coffee mug halfway to her lips. It was Tuesday morning, and Richard had shown up at 7 a.m. with fresh pastries and a request that left her speechless. "I want to come to your pottery class," Richard repeated, his grey eyes earnest. "If you'll let me." Maya, who was making herself coffee in paint-splattered pajamas, snorted with laughter. "This I have to see Mr. Billion-Dollar Empire getting his hands dirty with clay." "Maya," Helena warned gently, though she was struggling not to smile herself. "What?" Maya shrugged. "I'm just saying the man probably hasn't touched anything that wasn't made of titanium or Italian leather in years." Richard looked down at his perfectly pressed shirt and expensive watch, then back at Helena. "She's not wrong, but I want to understand what makes you happy. What you do when you're not being my wife." The words hit Helena unexpectedly. "When you're not being my wife." As if he finally understood that she was a person beyond her role in his life. For Richard, pottery class isn't exactly... Helena searched for the right words. "It's not glamorous, it's messy and frustrating, and I'm genuinely terrible at it." "Good," Richard said, surprising her. "I could use some practice at being terrible at something." Helena studied his face, looking for signs of the impatience or condescension she'd grown accustomed to when he humored her interests. Instead, she found genuine curiosity, and something that looked almost like nervousness. "It's at 7 p.m., she said finally, "in a community center in Culver City. Not exactly your usual scene." "My usual scene hasn't been working out so well for me lately," Richard replied quietly. Helena felt something inside her chest flutter. Not quite hope, but maybe its distant cousin. "Okay, but you have to promise me something. Anything. No phone. No emergencies. No stepping outside to take important calls." Helena's voice grew firm. "This is my space, Richard. If you're going to be there, you have to actually be there." Richard reached into his pocket and, to Helena's amazement, powered down his phone completely. "Done." Maya nearly dropped her coffee mug. Did he just turn off his lifeline to corporate America? "Apparently," Helena murmured, still staring at Richard's dark phone screen. The pottery studio was exactly what Richard had expected, and nothing like what he'd prepared for. Located in a converted warehouse, it buzzed with creative energy that felt foreign to his world of sterile boardrooms and glass offices. Students of all ages sat at mismatched tables, their hands covered in clay, their clothes splattered with evidence of artistic attempts. Helena led him to a table in the back, and Richard watched her transform as they entered the space. Her shoulders relaxed, her smile became genuine, and she moved with a confidence he hadn't seen in their own home for years. "Helena!" called out an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a colorful bandana. "You brought a friend." "This is my husband, Richard," Helena said, and Richard noticed she didn't add any of his usual titles or credentials. "Just Richard." "I'm Dolores," the woman said, offering Richard a clay-covered hand to shake. "Fair warning, pottery is humbling. Your ego might not survive the evening." Richard shook her hand without hesitation, getting clay on his expensive suit. "I think my ego could use some humbling." As Dolores set them up with clay and tools, Richard watched Helena settle into her familiar rhythm. She wedged her clay with practiced movements, her face peaceful in a way he rarely saw anymore. "What are you making tonight?" he asked, genuinely curious. "I'm working on a bowl," Helena said, beginning to center her clay on the wheel. "It's probably going to be lopsided and crack in the kiln, but that's not really the point." "What is the point?" Helena considered this as her hands shaped the spinning clay. "The point is that for 2 hours, nothing else exists except this moment. No expectations, no performance, no being perfect for anyone else." Richard felt the words like a gentle slap. When was the last time Helena had felt free from the pressure to be perfect for him? His own pottery attempt was, predictably, a disaster. The clay refused to cooperate, collapsing into misshapen lumps despite his best efforts. After his third failed attempt, Richard sat back with a rueful laugh. "This is harder than negotiating with venture capitalists," he admitted. Helena looked over at his clay carnage and smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile he'd seen from her in months. "The trick is not trying to control it so much. Let the clay tell you what it wants to be." "I'm not very good at letting things be what they want to be," Richard said quietly. Their eyes met across the table, and Helena's smile faded into something more serious. "I know." For the next hour, Richard struggled with more than just clay. He fought against his instinct to check his watch, to calculate the cost of the deals he wasn't making, to optimize this experience into something productive. Instead, he focused on Helena's voice as she guided him through the basics, on the feel of the clay between his fingers, on the satisfied expressions of the other students. "Better," Helena said, as Richard finally managed to create something that vaguely resembled a bowl. "It's crooked and the walls are uneven, but it's yours." Richard looked at his imperfect creation, strangely proud of its flaws. "It's terrible." "It's honest," Helena corrected. "That's what I love about pottery. You can't fake it. The clay reveals exactly who you are. Impatient, controlling, gentle, creative. It doesn't lie." "What does your pottery say about you?" Richard asked, watching her put finishing touches on her own bowl. Helena considered this, her hands never stopping their gentle work. "That I'm still learning to believe I deserve to take up space, that I'm afraid of being too much or not enough, but also that I'm stronger than I thought I was." Richard stared at her, this woman he'd married but somehow never really known. "Helena, don't," she said softly, not looking up from her work. "Don't apologize again, don't make promises you might not keep, just be here right now, that's enough." So Richard was there. He listened to Dolores tell stories about her late husband, laughed when a teenager's bowl exploded on the wheel, and felt something loosen in his chest when Helena's face lit up as she successfully pulled up the walls of her creation. At the end of class, as they cleaned clay from under their fingernails, Helena turned to him with something that might have been hope in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For coming, for staying, for not once checking your phone, or making me feel like you had somewhere more important to be." Richard looked down at his clay-stained shirt and ruined shoes, then back at Helena's peaceful expression. "I didn't have somewhere more important to be, I mean." "I know," Helena said, and Richard realized she was right. For the first time in years, he'd been exactly where he needed to be. As they walked to their cars, Helena paused. "Richard? Yeah? My pottery teacher Dolores? She's been married for 47 years. You know what she told me last week when I mentioned we were having problems?" Richard waited, almost afraid to hear the answer. "She said the secret isn't finding someone perfect. It's finding someone willing to keep choosing you, even when it's hard, even when you're both a mess." Helena got into her car, leaving Richard standing in the parking lot of a community center in Culver City, his expensive suit stained with clay, holding a lopsided bowl that looked like nothing he'd ever created before. And for the first time in years, he felt like he might be learning how to choose her back. Richard had never been inside a children's hospital before. Standing in the lobby of Children's Hospital Los Angeles on Saturday morning, he felt completely out of his element. The walls were painted in cheerful pastels, cartoon characters smiled down from murals, and the air hummed with a mixture of hope and heartbreak that made his chest tight. Helena emerged from the elevator wearing jeans, sneakers, and a volunteer badge that read, "Storytime Helena." She looked surprised to see him, then concerned. "Richard, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "I wanted to see this part of your life too," he said simply, holding up a canvas bag. "I brought books, in case you needed extras." Helena stared at him, then at the bag full of children's books he'd obviously spent time selecting. "You bought books? I may have cleaned out the children's section at Barnes & Noble," Richard admitted, looking suddenly uncertain. "I wasn't sure what age groups you read to, so I got everything from picture books to middle-grade novels." A slow smile spread across Helena's face. "You researched age-appropriate literature. I also may have Googled best books for hospitalized children and how to read aloud to kids, and possibly watched several YouTube tutorials on storytelling voices." Richard's cheeks flushed slightly. "I want to do this right." Helena felt something warm unfurl in her chest. This man who commanded boardrooms had spent his Friday evening learning how to make funny voices for children's books. "Come on," she said, gesturing toward the elevator. "But I should warn you, this isn't like your business meetings. Kids don't care about your resume." "Good," Richard said, following her. I'm getting tired of being judged by my resume anyway. The pediatric oncology ward was nothing like Richard had imagined. Yes, there were medical equipment and the quiet efficiency of nurses, but there was also laughter, artwork covering the walls, and a resilient joy that seemed to emanate from the children themselves. Helena led him to a bright playroom where a small group of kids had already gathered. They ranged in age from about 5 to 12, some in wheelchairs, others with IV poles, all looking at Richard with undisguised curiosity. "Friends," Helena announced, "this is my husband, Richard. He wanted to help with story time today." "Is he famous?" asked a 7-year-old girl with a colorful headscarf where her hair should be. "Are you a superhero?" added a boy who couldn't have been more than 6. Richard knelt down to their eye level, his expensive suit forgotten. "I'm not famous or a superhero. I'm just someone who loves stories and wanted to share them with you." "Do you know any good voices?" asked the girl seriously. "Helena does the best voices." Richard glanced at Helena, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Well, I've been practicing. Want to hear my dragon voice?" For the next hour, Richard discovered a part of himself he'd forgotten existed. He roared like dragons, squeaked like mice, and made exaggerated facial expressions that had the children giggling. When he read Where the Wild Things Are, he became Max sailing to the land of the wild things, complete with monster growls that made a shy 10-year-old boy laugh out loud for the first time since his treatment started. Helena watched from her chair, reading to smaller children, but Richard caught her glancing over with something that looked like wonder. This wasn't the polished CEO who spoke to investors, or the distracted husband who ate dinner while reading emails. This was someone she'd never seen before, playful, present, completely absorbed in bringing joy to children who needed it desperately. "You're really good at this," whispered Emma, the 7-year-old in the headscarf, during a quiet moment. "Are you going to come back?" "Would you like me to?" Richard asked seriously. "Yeah, you make funny faces like my dad used to." Emma's expression grew wistful for a moment before brightening again. "Will you read the dragon book again next time?" "Absolutely," Richard promised and meant it. As the session wound down, Helena helped children back to their rooms while Richard packed up the books. A nurse approached him smiling. "First time volunteering here?" she asked. "Is it that obvious?" "You have that look," she said kindly, "like you just discovered something you didn't know was missing. Helena's told us about you. She's very proud of what you've built with your company." Richard looked across the room where Helena was hugging goodbye to a little boy in a wheelchair. "I think I've been building the wrong things." "Not wrong," the nurse corrected, "just incomplete." Later, as they walked to the parking garage, Helena was unusually quiet. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Richard asked. "I'm trying to figure out who that was in there," Helena said finally. "The man reading stories, making dragon voices, promising Emma he'd come back next week." "That was me," Richard said simply. "But it wasn't the me you married." Helena stopped walking and turned to face him. "That's what I'm trying to understand. Where has that man been for the past 4 years?" Richard considered this, leaning against his car. "Buried, I think. Under quarterly reports and profit margins and the pressure to be the Richard Cole everyone expected me to be." "And what changed?" "You stopped seeing me," Richard said quietly. "And I realized that if I'd lost the one person whose opinion actually mattered, then maybe the person I'd become wasn't worth being." Helena studied his face in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the parking garage. "Those kids in there, they don't care that you're worth billions of dollars." "I know," it was refreshing. "Emma lost her father to cancer 6 months ago," Helena said softly. "When she said you reminded her of him, that wasn't casual." That was the highest compliment she could give. Richard felt his throat tighten. "I didn't know." "That's what I love about this place," Helena continued. "It strips away everything superficial. Money doesn't matter here. Status doesn't matter. Only kindness matters. Only being present matters." "Is that why you come here?" Helena nodded. "When I felt invisible at home, I came here and remembered that I could still matter to someone, that I could still make a difference." Richard felt another wave of shame wash over him. While he'd been building his empire, Helena had been building something much more important: connections, purpose, meaning. "Helena," he said carefully, "would it be okay if I came back next week? Not as your husband trying to prove something, but because I genuinely want to be here." Helena looked at him for a long moment, and Richard held his breath. "Emma will be disappointed if you don't," she said finally, a small smile playing at her lips. "And you? Will you be disappointed?" "Richard Cole," Helena said, stepping closer, "I haven't seen you smile like you did in there in years. If volunteering with sick children brings back the man who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, Then yes, I want you to come back. Even if I'm terrible at it? You weren't terrible. You were real. Helena reached out and straightened his tie, which had gotten crooked during his dragon performance. That little boy who hadn't laughed since starting chemo? He giggled for 10 straight minutes because of your silly voices. Richard caught her hand as she fixed his tie, holding it gently against his chest. I forgot how good it feels to make someone happy without closing a deal. I forgot that you could, Helena admitted softly. They stood there in the parking garage, hands touching, both of them feeling like they'd glimpsed something they'd thought was lost forever. One day at a time? Richard asked, echoing their promise from earlier. One story at a time, Helena replied, and Richard realized she wasn't just talking about the children's books. As he drove home to their empty mansion, Richard found himself already looking forward to Saturday morning, to Emma's bright smile, to the sound of Helena's laughter when he made ridiculous voices. For the first time in years, he had something to look forward to that had nothing to do with profit margins, and everything to do with the person he was slowly remembering how to be. Helena found Richard in the most unexpected place. She'd returned to their Malibu mansion on Thursday evening to collect more clothes, expecting to find the house empty as usual. Instead, she discovered her husband sitting cross-legged on their kitchen floor, surrounded by photo albums, loose pictures, and what appeared to be several craft store shopping bags. Richard! Helena stood in the doorway, completely bewildered. What are you doing? He looked up, his hair disheveled, his sleeves rolled up, and a smudge of something that looked like glue on his cheek. Making something for you. Helena moved closer, taking in the chaos around him. Pictures from their relationship were scattered everywhere. Some she'd forgotten existed, others she remembered taking with perfect clarity. Wedding photos, vacation snapshots, candid moments from their early dating days. Is that a scrapbook? She asked, noticing the half-finished album in his lap. Terrible, right? Richard laughed, but it was self-deprecating rather than bitter. I've been working on it for 3 days. Turns out I'm as bad at crafting as I am at pottery. Helena knelt beside him, careful not to disturb his organized chaos. Each page was carefully arranged with photos, ticket stubs, and handwritten notes. The craftsmanship was amateur at best. Crooked corners, uneven spacing, obvious signs of multiple attempts, but the love behind it was unmistakable. Richard, this is... She picked up a finished page showing their second anniversary dinner, complete with the restaurant menu he'd somehow saved. You kept the menu from Le Bernardin. I kept everything, he said quietly. Every receipt, every note, every stupid little memento from every date we ever went on. I just forgot to look at them. Helena turned the page and found photos from their weekend in Napa Valley, including several she'd never seen before. When did you take these? When you weren't looking. You were talking to that winemaker about sustainable farming, completely in your element, and I couldn't stop taking pictures. Richard's voice grew soft. You were so passionate, so alive. I wanted to capture that version of you forever. But you never showed me these photos. I got busy, put them in a box with good intentions, and then forgot. Richard gestured helplessly at the scattered memories around them. I seem to have made a habit of that. Helena continued flipping through the scrapbook, her heart clenching at the care evident in every page. Richard had written captions under many of the photos, some funny, some romantic, all achingly personal. Helena discovering she hates wine tasting, but loves the stories behind each vintage. The moment I knew I wanted to marry her, she's arguing with a tech executive about AI ethics and winning. Our first fight, made up 2 hours later with ice cream and terrible reality TV. You remember all of this? Helena whispered. I remember everything. I just stopped acting like it mattered. Richard set down the photo he'd been positioning and looked at her directly. These past 2 weeks, going through all of this, I realized something. I didn't fall out of love with you, Helena. I fell out of practice. Practice? Loving you actively, intentionally, every day. Richard's voice grew stronger. I got lazy. I started treating our love like a closed deal instead of something that needed constant attention and care. Helena felt tears prick her eyes. Richard, I know a scrapbook doesn't fix 4 years of neglect, he continued quickly, but I wanted you to see that those moments mattered to me, that you've always mattered to me, even when I was too stupid to show it. Helena turned to another page and gasped. It was their first pottery class together. Richard had somehow gotten copies of the photos Dolores had taken, including one of Helena laughing at his misshapen bowl. How did you get these? I went back to the studio yesterday. Dolores had them developed. Richard's cheeks flushed slightly. I also signed up for private lessons. Apparently I need a lot of work. You signed up for pottery lessons? I signed up for a lot of things, Richard admitted. Pottery lessons, cooking classes, photography workshops. I figured if I'm going to learn how to be a better husband, I should probably learn how to be a more interesting person first. Helena stared at him. This man who'd built a technology empire but was now sitting on their kitchen floor, learning to glue photos into a scrapbook. You've been busy. I've been desperate, Richard corrected honestly. Desperate to become someone worthy of a second chance. Helena closed the scrapbook carefully and set it aside, then really looked at her husband. There were dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he hadn't been sleeping well. His usual perfect appearance was replaced by something more rumpled, more human, more real. Why are you doing this, Richard? Really? Because I love you, he said simply. And because I finally understand that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every day, a practice you commit to, a skill you develop. And you want to develop that skill. I want to become the kind of man who sees you every day, who asks about your pottery class and remembers the answers, who brings you coffee in your favorite mug without being asked. Richard's voice grew thick with emotion. I want to be the kind of husband who celebrates your dreams instead of ignoring them. Helena felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking, but healing. What about your work, your empire? We'll survive with better boundaries, Richard said firmly. I hired 2 new VPs this week, delegated half my responsibilities, started saying no to deals that aren't essential. Richard Cole saying no to deals. Helena couldn't hide her amazement. Richard Cole learning that the most important deal of his life isn't happening in a boardroom, he corrected. It's happening right here, with the woman he's been taking for granted. They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the evidence of their love story. The good, the bad, the forgotten, and the cherished. I've been staying at Myers for 2 weeks, Helena said finally. I know. I've been trying to figure out if the man I married still exists. And what have you decided? Helena picked up one of the loose photos, a candid shot of Richard reading to the children at the hospital, his face animated with joy. I think he's been there all along, just buried under a lot of very expensive suits and very important meetings. Richard let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. So what happens now? Helena looked around their kitchen at the photo albums and craft supplies, at the man who'd spent 3 days learning to use a glue stick to build her a love letter. Then she looked at Richard, really looked at him, and saw something she'd thought was lost forever. She saw her husband. Now, Helena said, picking up a photo and some glue, you teach me how to scrapbook, because if we're rebuilding our story, we should probably do it together. Richard's smile was brighter than anything she'd seen in years. I should warn you, I'm terrible at it. Good, Helena said, echoing his words from the pottery studio. I could use some practice at being terrible at something too. As they worked side by side on their kitchen floor, carefully placing photos and writing captions, Helena felt something she hadn't experienced in their house for years. She felt at home. And when Richard reached for her hand between pages, glue on both their fingers, she didn't pull away. Because sometimes coming home isn't about returning to a place. Sometimes it's about returning to each other. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Helena woke to the sound of Richard's phone buzzing on his nightstand, the first time it had been in their bedroom in weeks. She watched through sleepy eyes as he sat up, checked the caller ID, and then did something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He declined the call and turned the phone face down. Richard? Helena whispered. Was that important? Probably, he said, settling back against his pillow. But nothing's more important than this. Helena had moved back home 3 days ago, cautiously optimistic but still guarded. They were sharing a bed again, but carefully, like 2 people learning to trust after a betrayal. The scrapbook project had become a nightly ritual, an hour after dinner spent reconstructing their love story, piece by piece. The phone buzzed again, then again. Richard, Helena said, now fully awake. Answer it. What if there's an emergency? Richard sighed and picked up the phone. Cole here. His voice was sharp, professional, but Helena noticed he didn't get out of bed. What do you mean the Singapore deal is falling apart? Richard sat up straighter, and Helena felt the familiar knot form in her stomach. No, I specifically said that clause was non-negotiable. Helena watched her husband's face transform as he listened, the peaceful expression of the man who'd been reading her poetry from their honeymoon, replaced by the hard angles of the CEO who'd forgotten she existed. I don't care what time it is there, Richard continued, his voice rising. Get Jameson on the line, set up a conference call with the entire team. We need to salvage this before... Helena got out of bed. Helena, wait, Richard called, covering the phone. This will just take a few minutes. No, Helena said quietly, but with absolute certainty. It won't. She walked to their closet and began pulling out clothes, her movements calm but purposeful. Richard watched her with growing panic, still holding the phone to his ear. "Sir?" came a voice from the other end. "Are you there?" "Hold on," Richard said into the phone. Then to Helena, "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 4 years ago," Helena replied, folding clothes with steady hands. "I'm choosing myself." "Helena, please, it's just one call." "It's never just one call, Richard." Helena turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that terrified him. Not anger, not hurt, but resolution. "It's one call that leads to another call that leads to flying to Singapore, that leads to another crisis that needs your immediate attention." The voice on the phone was getting louder, more insistent. Richard stared at Helena, then at the phone, paralyzed by a choice he'd never had to make so explicitly before. "Sir, we really need your input here. The investors are threatening to pull out, and if we lose Singapore, the entire Asian expansion—" "Helena," Richard said desperately, "this deal is worth $400 million. Helena stopped packing and looked at him with something that might have been pity. "And I'm worth nothing." "That's not what I meant, isn't it?" Helena's voice remained steady, but Richard could see tears gathering in her eyes. "Because that's the choice you're making right now. That's the choice you've been making for 4 years. Mr. Cole?" The voice on the phone was insistent now. "We need an answer." Richard looked at the phone in his hand, then at Helena, who was waiting with the patience of someone who already knew how this would end. The Singapore deal was massive, the kind of acquisition that would cement Technova's dominance in the Asian market, secure hundreds of jobs, generate profits for decades. It was also just another deal. "Johnson," Richard said into the phone, his voice suddenly clear. "Yes, sir? You're going to handle this?" "Sir, I don't think I'm qualified to—" "Then get qualified. Fast." Richard's eyes never left Helena's face. "Use the Yamamoto strategy from the Tokyo expansion. If Singapore won't accept our terms, walk away. There will be other deals." "But sir, this is—" "Johnson!" Richard's voice was firm but not unkind. "I'm going to hang up now. I'm going to turn off my phone. And I'm going to trust you to do the job I hired you to do. If you can't handle it, we'll discuss that when I get to the office. Later. Much later." Helena stopped packing. "Sir, you can't just—" Richard hung up. Then, while Helena watched in amazement, he powered down the phone completely and placed it in his nightstand drawer. "What did you just do?" Helena whispered. "I chose you," Richard said simply. "I chose us. Richard, that deal will either happen or it won't." Without me micromanaging every detail, Richard stood and walked over to where Helena stood frozen beside their bed. "I've spent 4 years choosing work over you, choosing profit over presence, choosing to be successful instead of choosing to be happy. But $400 million means nothing if I lose you." Richard's voice broke slightly. "Helena, I built an empire, but what's the point of ruling the world if you're sitting on the throne alone?" Helena stared at him, this man who'd just walked away from the biggest deal of his career to have a conversation with his wife at 4 a.m. "You don't understand," she said, tears now flowing freely. "That's exactly what I needed you to do 4 years ago. Choose me. Choose us. Just once." "I'm choosing you now," Richard said, reaching for her hands. "I'm choosing you every day from now on. The pottery classes, the hospital volunteering, the scrapbooks, none of that matters if I don't choose you when it really counts." Helena looked into his grey eyes and saw something she'd thought was lost forever. Not just love, but priority. She wasn't an afterthought or a convenience. She was his choice. "What if you lose the deal?" she asked. "Then I lose a deal. I've lost deals before." Richard cupped her face gently. "But I can't lose you again. I won't survive it." Helena felt the last of her walls crumble. This wasn't the man who'd ignored her for 4 years. This wasn't even the man who'd been trying to win her back for the past month. This was the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd seen her, chosen her, valued her above everything else. "Richard," she whispered. "I love you, Helena Carter Cole," he said, his voice strong and sure. "Not because you make my life easier, or because you look beautiful at charity galas, or because you're the perfect CEO's wife. I love you because you're brilliant and passionate and kind, because you make terrible jokes and cry at commercials, and somehow see the best in everyone, even me." "Even when I'm invisible?" Helena asked, testing. "You were never invisible," Richard said, pulling her closer. "I was just blind, but I see you now." I see you choosing to volunteer with sick children because you believe in the power of stories. I see you taking pottery classes because you need something that's just yours. I see you building a life that has meaning beyond what I can provide." Helena was crying in earnest now, but they were different tears. Not the tears of someone who'd given up, but of someone who'd finally been seen. "And I want to be part of that life," Richard continued. "Not as the center of it, but as your partner in it. Your equal, your choice. What if I choose you back?" Helena asked softly. "Then we figure out how to choose each other every day, even when it's hard, even when there are $400 million deals on the line." Helena laughed despite her tears. "Especially then." Richard kissed her then soft and sure, and Helena felt like she was coming home to herself for the first time in years. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "No more packing?" Richard asked hopefully. "No more packing," Helena confirmed. "But Richard?" "Yeah? If your phone rings again tonight, I'm throwing it off the balcony." Richard laughed, the sound rich and free. "Deal. Besides, I'm thinking of switching careers anyway." "To what?" "Professional story reader. I hear the benefits are incredible, terrible pay, but you get to make kids laugh and come home to the woman you love every night." Helena smiled, the first completely unguarded smile she'd given him since that night in silk pajamas that had started everything. "The woman you love is going to hold you to that," she said. "Good," Richard replied, pulling her back into bed with him. "I'm counting on it." As they settled back under the covers, Helena's head on Richard's chest, his arms around her like a promise, she felt something she hadn't experienced in their bedroom for years: peace. And when the sun rose a few hours later, they were still choosing each other. 1 year later, Helena stood in the doorway of their home office, watching Richard read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to a laptop screen with the same dramatic flair he'd once reserved for board presentations. His audience, 12 children from the hospital's virtual storytime program, giggled at his exaggerated chomping sounds as the caterpillar ate through various foods. "And what happened next?" Richard asked the screen conspiratorially. "He turned into a butterfly," shouted Emma, now cancer-free and sporting a head of beautiful curls that made Helena's heart sing every time she saw them. "That's right. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations happen when we think everything is falling apart," Richard said, and Helena knew he wasn't just talking about caterpillars. After storytime ended and Richard closed the laptop, Helena entered the office carrying 2 cups of coffee, his in a simple white mug, hers in the ceramic cup that still held their love story. "How did the Singapore team handle the quarterly review without you?" she asked, settling into the reading chair they'd added to his office. "Brilliantly," Richard said, accepting his coffee with a kiss. "Turns out when you hire good people and actually trust them to do their jobs, they exceed expectations." Helena smiled. The Singapore deal had fallen through that night a year ago, but Richard's willingness to delegate had led to something better, a leaner, more efficient company where he worked normal hours and his team thrived with autonomy. Technova's profits had actually increased when Richard stopped trying to control every detail. "Speaking of transformations," Helena said, pulling an official-looking envelope from her pocket. "This came today." Richard recognized the UCLA letterhead immediately. "Helena, I got in," she said, her voice barely containing her excitement. "Full acceptance to the doctoral program in psychology. They even offered me a research assistantship studying, and I quote, technology's impact on modern relationships." Richard set down his coffee and crossed the room in 3 strides, lifting Helena off her feet and spinning her around. "You're going to be Dr. Helena Cole." "Dr. Helena Carter Cole," she corrected, laughing. "I'm keeping both names. The woman who fell in love with you and the woman who found herself again." "I love that woman," Richard said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "Both versions of her. Even the one who's going to be buried in textbooks and research papers for the next 4 years. Especially that one," Richard said firmly. "I can't wait to watch you change the world." Helena felt tears prick her eyes. A year ago, she couldn't have imagined this conversation happening. A year ago, Richard would have found 17 reasons why doctoral school wasn't practical, wasn't convenient, wasn't the right time. "What about your schedule?" she asked, testing. "My classes will be 3 evenings a week, plus research time on weekends." "Then I guess I'll have to master the art of leftover reheating," Richard said with a grin. "And maybe Emma and the other kids can teach me some new story voices while you're studying." "You realize this means I'll be even more terrible at pottery class, right? Less time to practice." "Good thing Dolores says pottery is about the journey, not the destination." Richard tucked a curl behind Helena's ear. Besides, I've been thinking about taking up painting. Maya's been offering to teach me watercolors. Helena stared at him. You want to learn to paint? I want to learn to see the world the way you see it, Richard said simply. Colorful, hopeful, full of possibility. They stood there in their office, surrounded by the life they'd built together. Photos from the hospital visits, pottery pieces they'd made, most lopsided but loved, books from their shared reading list, and the scrapbook that had grown into several volumes of their ongoing love story. Helena, Richard said suddenly, his voice taking on a nervous quality she hadn't heard in months. Yeah? There's something I've been wanting to ask you. Helena's heart skipped. Richard, if this is about taking on more responsibility at Technova, it's not about work, he said quickly, then dropped to one knee. Helena's hands flew to her mouth. Richard, what are you doing? Something I should have done 4 years ago, Richard said, pulling out a simple, elegant ring, nothing like the enormous diamond he'd given her for their engagement. This one was smaller, more personal, with a stone the color of her favorite coffee mug. Helena Carter Cole, Richard said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. 4 years ago I married you, but I didn't choose you every day like I promised. I let work and ambition, and my own insecurity, make me forget that you were the greatest success I'd ever achieved. Helena was crying now, but she was also smiling. I can't give you back those lost years, Richard continued, but I can promise you every day from now on. I can promise to choose you when the phone rings at 3 a.m. I can promise to celebrate your dreams as loudly as my own. I can promise to see you, really see you, even when life gets complicated. Richard, will you marry me again? He asked. Not the CEO and the perfect wife, but Richard and Helena, two imperfect people who are better together than apart. Helena looked down at this man who'd learned to make dragon voices for sick children, who'd spent 3 days making her a scrapbook, who'd walked away from $400 million to have a conversation with his wife. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, of course, yes. Richard slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like he'd always known exactly who she was, and stood to kiss her. It was the kind of kiss that tasted like promises and coffee, and the particular sweetness of second chances. When? Helena asked when they broke apart. Whenever you want, wherever you want, however you want, Richard said. This time it's your choice. I want it to be simple, Helena said immediately. Just us, our families, maybe the kids from the hospital. I want Emma to be our flower girl, and Dolores to make the pottery for the reception, and Maya to paint our wedding portrait, Helena added, laughing. And terrible homemade food because I still can't cook despite 6 months of lessons? Perfect, Helena said, meaning it completely. Later that evening, as they worked side by side adding photos from the past year to their latest scrapbook, Helena found herself marveling at how different their life looked now. There were pictures of Richard covered in clay, of Helena in her volunteer t-shirt, of both of them laughing at something ridiculous. They looked older maybe, but also more alive. Do you ever miss it? Helena asked, as she glued down a photo of them at Maya's art show. The adrenaline rush of the big deals, the power, the intensity. Richard considered this seriously, as he'd learned to consider all her questions. I miss the feeling of building something important, he said finally. But I realized I was building the wrong thing. Money and power are fine, but they're not legacy. What is? Richard pointed to a photo of Emma hugging them both after her last treatment, then to another of Helena presenting her research proposal to her professors, then to one of them both covered in flour after a disastrous attempt at making anniversary dinner. This, he said simply, love that grows instead of fades, children who laugh because we showed up, a marriage that gets stronger instead of more convenient. That's legacy. Helena leaned over and kissed his cheek, tasting clay dust from his afternoon pottery session. I love the man you've become. I love the woman you've always been, Richard replied. I just finally learned how to see her. As they finished the latest chapter of their scrapbook, Helena felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her, not the false peace of a perfect life, but the real satisfaction of a life fully lived, fully chosen, fully shared. Helena? Richard said as they prepared for bed. Thank you for not giving up on us. Helena turned to look at him, really look at him, taking in the crow's feet that had appeared from genuine laughter, the hands that were now permanently stained with clay, the eyes that saw her completely. Thank you for learning to choose me, she said. Every day, Richard promised, for the rest of our lives. And as they settled into their bed, Helena's doctoral acceptance letter on the nightstand next to Richard's pottery class schedule, she knew he meant it. Because sometimes love isn't about finding the perfect person. Sometimes it's about choosing to become the person worthy of the love you've been given, and choosing that person every single day. Sometimes we get so caught up in building the perfect life that we forget to live it with the people who matter most. Helena and Richard's story reminds us that love isn't a destination. It's a daily choice to see, value, and prioritize the person standing beside us. True success isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by the relationships we nurture and the love we choose to give freely. What did this story teach you about love, second chances, and the courage to choose each other even when it's difficult? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.